Steak Bites, where we carve out space for meaningful conversations that go beyond the grill. I'm Kara Smith, your host and fellow enthusiast for all things tasteful and fulfilling. Today, we're delving into a topic that touches both our planet and our plates: sustainability. What does it really mean? How can we cut through the buzzwords to understand the true impact on agriculture and the environment? Help us unpack this today, we have Dr. John Ritten with Colorado State University. He's an expert on the economics of sustainability, and we're going to dive into carbon sequestering, ESG markets, and much more. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Ritten.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Let's dive into, from a high level, what does sustainability really mean? Which I know is a very nuanced question. But if you're just to talk to a common consumer, you know, they're worried about where their food choices, they're concerned about the planet. They want to be just, you know, a more of a patron of that. What would you say at a high level that really should mean, or what a consumer really should look at?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that's kind of hard to pin down for a couple of reasons. But when we think about sustainability, we're really kind of looking at three kind of aspects. There's the economic sustainability, right? So if an operation isn't able to stay in business, it's not sustainable and can't enact any sort of change you want to see on the ground. There's also the environmental aspect, which I think is probably getting more press these days than the other two, right? So looking at I think from your introduction, looking a little bit at, you know, kind of greenhouse gas emissions and footprints, right? And so carbon sequestration is part of that, but also looking at impacts to wildlife, right? Water quality and quantity and all the different things, you know, wildfire suppression. And then the last one is social impact. So again, animal welfare typically falls into that social aspect, but also things like, you know, kind of equitable access, food security are parts of it, as well as, you know, community viability, as we see specifically with agricultural operations and how they feed into these rural communities. Do we have enough, you know, kids in an area to justify a school, and do we have a grocery store and a post office and a bank? So those sorts of things. So really, it's trying to tie all those three broad kind of areas together, and then understanding the trade-offs within and across those three.
Sure. So within the sustainability space, there's been more and more conversation about regenerative agriculture. Could you touch on that, maybe tie those two together, or maybe kind of for our listeners, maybe segment those two of what does that really mean? What does regenerative agriculture actually mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as there are about a million different definitions as for sustainable, there's as many for regenerative, right? And so I think regenerative is probably, you know, a subcomponent of sustainable. I don't think it's, you know, different. It's just a way that some people try to define that. CSU is actually launching a regenerative food systems degree program here for undergraduates. And so the definition we use is that regenerative food systems promote varied approaches that replenish resources and support resilient communities through adaptive management. It aids in decarbonizing the food system, enhances farming resilience to climate shocks, excuse me, and by following ecological principles, it boosts economic viability, produces nutritious food, and empowers farmers with versatile tools. So again, it's kind of hitting on all three of those pillars of sustainability, but I think regenerative practices really tend to focus on adaptability, right? And so giving people options to achieve outcomes and less prescriptive than maybe some of the other sustainable practices out there, and really does kind of heighten that focus on communities, right? So it's beyond just food production, but how do we impact our neighbors, right, in the world? And so there's a little broader focus on that social aspect of sustainability with a lot of these regenerative systems. But again, it's varied by who you're talking to. They have a different kind of internal definition they likely use.
Sure. Well, I think you hit on something really important there, was your community, kind of where you are in part of the world. My husband and I, the co-founders of Colorado Crop Beef, we talk about that a lot because we both come from production ag to begin with. We cannot do something on our ranch the same as somebody down the road because it is very different. Could you touch on some of those nuances? You know, maybe we get into the beef production, you know, cattle side of this, of like how different that may be, you know, from this part of Colorado to Georgia or California or different things like that. Just understanding some of those nuances, I think, would be helpful.
Yeah, and so like anytime we talk about food production in general, but specifically any sort of sustainability claims, it's all context dependent, right? And so just from a biophysical standpoint, soils and climate will have a pretty big impact on what you can and can't do, as well as some of those outcomes that people currently care about, including, carbon markets, right? So soils and climate can be a limiting factor as to what you're able to do, even though people may put some real unrealistic expectations on us. But then also just our kind of market structure and financial systems, right? And so there's limited ways to get through the supply chain, specifically for beef, right? All the way from seed stock producers, cow calf, yearlings, feedlots, processors, all the way down to that retail shelf or the farmer's market or that restaurant, right? And so there's multiple channels, but they're pretty fixed, right? And so again, where you are geographically impacts, whether or not you have to feed hay in the wintertime. I grew up in South Dakota, spent a lot of time in Wyoming, working in Montana, right? And so there's just months of the year that we can't graze, right? And so we need to provide additional feed input. Whereas, you mentioned Georgia, all right, there's areas of the country that aren't as reliant on fed forage resources for our livestock. And so there is no right answer, right? There is no model of sustainability. It's fitting your operation to your local environment, and that includes kind of your social structure of your community as well.
And I think that's great to talk about how nuanced it really is. So, from a consumer perspective, what direct impact could a consumer have on the environment per se through their food choices? If you were to say one thing of like, hey, consider this, what would you say that would be?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because in a population as large as our nations, as well as the world, right, it can feel like one voice or one vote isn't really that meaningful. But I think um, before I would encourage anyone to make a specific choice is really understand not just the nuance, but also what we'd call the cascading implications of a choice, right? So kind of second, third, fourth level impacts or maybe unintended consequences. And so is this something that I want the entire industry to follow suit, or is it something that fits me and my values and my family and my location? And so really understanding, where food comes from and aligning that with your personal values, right? So again, I don't think there's a right answer for this for every person out there, and we evolve in our preferences over our lifespan, right? And so I make different decisions today than I made 10 years ago. I'm sure in 10 or 20 years, if I'm still around, I'll be making different decisions as I gain new information and learn more about, this food system that we live in. Because I think at the end of the day, we all need to eat, right? A lot of us want to eat 3 meals a day. We all can't get there, unfortunately. And so I think understanding the impacts to your not just personal values, but make sure that your family is fed and healthy, and make sure that we can do as much as we can to support those around us we care about as well. But really, just understand where that food comes from, how it's produced, and then understand what those cascading impacts are of altered management, specifically as we scale up, right? So instead of just one operation, think about what this means for the county, the state, the region, and the nation, and understand that there is not a single correct choice, right? And so really just looking at those alternatives, and just being skeptical is probably not the right word, but really, just studying it and make sure that you truly understand what those claims mean, because there's a lot of claims that are made that may or may not be backed up by evidence on the ground.
So, when we have that conversation around claims, around food claims, food labeling, we have a conversation around that about daily, frankly, of new labels, new claims, all of the new things that are coming out there. uh, we typically stand on like have a conversation around it, as you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
understand where that claim comes from, and the further removed we get away from that claim, unfortunately, the more kind of nuanced it is, and maybe the lack of understanding we have of it. So even us in production agriculture, there's some of those things that we don't have a ton of clarity with. I'd love for you to dive into for a second, even at a high level, um, the carbon markets and kind of the ESG push from a lot of large corporations, and kind of how that plays into production ag, because that's something that we are seeing from a high level of, ooh, that's very nuanced. So from your professional opinion, your thought process, could you help explain that to a common consumer of all of the interesting things that are happening right now in the market?
Yeah, and it's great. Things are cyclical, right? So this was probably a similar talk I would have had 15 or 20 years ago. And then things kind of died down, and now we're seeing this renewed interest. So carbon markets really focused on one of two things: either preventing additional emissions, right? So get people to emit less, or remove existing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, right? So removal or just prevention is at the heart of these markets. And so right now we see, right, this renewed interest in using agricultural lands to sequester carbon, pull it out of the air, store it underground, right? And so in theory, this provides another revenue source for producers, whether you're row crops or ranchers, right? But the key underlying points for these markets that I don't think a lot of attention is additionality and permanence, right? And so in order for us to remove additional carbon from the atmosphere, we need to change our management in some way, shape, or form, right? So if someone wants to pay us to remove carbon, again, they're not going to pay me for doing what I already do because they would get that for free, right? So we need to provide that added value by sequestering additional carbon than the status quo. The other thing that's really important is, carbon has a lifespan of 1,000 years or so in the atmosphere, right? And so we need to make sure that once we get it underground, it stays there, right? And both of those things are challenging from a ranching perspective because, granted, there's a large land base in this country and globally that's considered rangeland, right? So the potential storage there is huge. But most of those well-maintained rangelands already, the cup's pretty well full. We can't add a whole lot of additional carbon, right? And so, and even in the areas where we can, the per acre storage, additional storage is much smaller than some other areas, right? So the financial incentives aren't quite as high as some other land uses. And then the other challenge is maintenance. So again, if I pay a producer to sequester carbon, I want to make sure it's there for the lifetime of that carbon in the atmosphere. And in the Western United States specifically, right, we see a lot of drought, we see a lot of wildfire. Those are our sources of carbon, not sinks. So we may not actually be able to guarantee that carbon is stored in the long term. But there's a lot of interest now, and again, some people that are really trying to figure out how to get large enough pools of carbon credits that are that the market wants, right? So a lot of these larger corporations with ESG commitments want to buy tens of thousands of carbon credits, not the 25 my ranch would generate, right? So we need to pool those to make them really, kind of accessible to those larger markets. And so I think the biggest area, again, is context matters, right? So soils matter, climate matters, as well as management. And then, so really understanding what that potential is. So if you get an offer, you get a contract, look at what that potential carbon storage is in the contract and understand, is that feasible? Is it realistic for my area? Because again, a lot of these are going after large geographic areas, and what works in Eastern Kansas may not be the same as Western Colorado, right? And so make sure that it's specific to your area and understand what happens for non-compliance. What if I get paid to sequester carbon, I take a big payment up front to install some infrastructure, and then I don't follow through on that contract, right? Where does that risk lie? That's something I think that we really need to be kind of vigilant about, is making sure that we understand the risk management of this. And then who pays for the monitoring and verification and reporting of the actual outcomes, right? So is it a model-based contract, or is it, I'm going to go pull soil samples, because those aren't necessarily cheap, right? And so is the onus on me as the rancher, or is the company going to cover those costs? And so I think as this feeds into that kind of corporate sustainability, is there's a lack of understanding, again, of that nuance and context in production ag from some of these corporate partners of ours. And that's understandable. They don't live on the land. They don't understand just how complex this can be. So the onus is, again, on us to understand what the implications are and whether or not this is a good opportunity for my operation. Does it fit into the goals and objectives of my ranch, as well as that broader industry goals of any sort of net zero commitment?
So, what is driving this from a business perspective? A lot of these ESG commitments. I'm sure it's different for every company, but what would you say, from a baseline, what is driving this here recently?
I think that a lot of consumers are starting to basically vote with their dollars, right? And so they're responding to consumer demands about not just the products they buy, but how they're made and the kind of values of the companies they support. And so as we continue to see, again, this is specifically with millennials and beyond, right? That a large percentage of that consumer group feels they can directly address climate change and social outcomes by supporting specific companies. And so these companies are responding because they want to continue to be in business. Again, one of the pillars of sustainability is economics, right? If I don't make money, I'm no longer around in 5 years to do the other good things. And so this really is a consumer-driven push, and companies are responding to it. And again, we talk about three different types of emissions in the corporate world. Scope 1 is the emissions that I directly generate. Scope 2 is the emissions generated from the energy I use, so often electricity, right? And then Scope 3 is everything in my supply chain I'm responsible for. And those are by far the majority of the emissions in the food space, but they're also the hardest to control because, again, there's 600,000 ranches in this country. How do we align everyone and get them to act in a certain way through just financial mechanisms? It's not always easy, nor should it be, right? Because we're all independent producers. And so really trying to understand how these companies are going to meet the needs of their consumers is going to be an interesting kind of challenge, I think, in the next 5 or 10 years, as that they've all made some sort of claims for net neutral production without a real good idea of how we're going to get there, just because the science is so new, right? We're learning every single day how to actually achieve some of these goals.
It's really fascinating to me that it's almost like a up and down supply chain, of course, of, hey, we have a lot of conversations with individuals around, essentially kind of our carbon footprint of what we're doing on the ranch and the fact that we have our entire supply chain in-house. So we have control of those inputs. And then you start getting further away from where food is produced. And then you have these large corporations basically backtracking back to the ranch, in essence, in agriculture, to bolster up their environmental impact, of their carbon credits, from where it's like, it is a very interesting, very nuanced that we almost have two sides of this coming to play, as far as a consumer being able to have kind of a direct line to rancher, their food, some of those things, to understand some of those. And then the further they get away, all of a sudden a larger corporation is trying to get back to that to be able to, prove their environmental impact, etc. It's really fascinating that we have of where we are. So to that point, within the very nuanced sustainability world, how would you have this conversation with a consumer about beef production as a whole? Because we historically recently have kind of come under fire as far as our environmental impact. So could you maybe touch on not necessarily just the industry as a whole, but some of the nuances within beef cattle production? I'm a ruminant nutritionist by trade, so a lot of just understanding that an environmental impact is quite a bit different with a cow, because they do have a superpower of having a rumen and they can utilize land that we typically could not. Could you touch on that, not necessarily just different production practices, but the entire beef supply chain, and why maybe that we may not deserve all of the focus that we recently have been having from an environmental perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we could probably spend about 3 weeks talking about it, right? So I'll try to be brief. But I do think, right, that you're right. There's a lot of, kind of noise press related to this right now. And then my first thing is, don't believe the tweets, right? This is complicated stuff. You can't boil this down to 140 or 280 characters, right? There are more than two sides to every story, and they're both probably right and probably wrong at the same time. So again, do some research. But I do think some things that we do know, right, is grazing lands have evolved, right, with grazing, rangelands have evolved with grazing pressure, right, with fire, with drought, with human management for millennia, right? We tend to ignore that fact or just conveniently forget about that, right? Even in this country, we've had land managers, right, stewarding our lands for millennia. There have been grazing animals. They've not always been domesticated, but they've been there, right? And so removing livestock from grazing lands would actually be detrimental to the health of that land, right? And so they provide things, again, like carbon sequestration, that green carbon cycle, right? Animals consume plants, promote more growth. We have more plant growth. We have that natural carbon cycle occurring. We also provide a lot of wildlife habitat, right, through grazing. And so I tend to think of livestock not just as, food production systems, little kind of food plants, but really ecosystem engineers, right? And so can we use these domesticated animals in a way that maybe wildlife are less easy to manage, right? So we can actually provide heterogeneous landscapes, right? So we have certain, birds that require tall structures, some that really like it grazed down with no structure right around at certain times of their life cycle. And we can provide that with livestock, right? And so it also, we can, through proper management, provide water infiltration, right? Better quality and quantity water storage, right? To get us through droughts. And so I think there's a lot of these benefits that we tend to forget about, specifically on the grazing side of beef production, right? But then to your point, right, the superpower, they do also turn, right, fiber, something that you and I can't digest, into this nutrient dense food source, right? And so I'm always concerned about food security, right? Not just in this country, but globally. And we have too many people that go to bed hungry every night, right? And so like this is a way to provide a lot of those micro and micronutrients to consumers. So again, we need to move beyond this kind of discussion of ranching and food production. It really is ecosystem engineering. And specifically as we get into, the coming years and decades, we have more technology, more ability to manage these animals, right? I think the opportunities really are going to unfold before us to really show how we steward these lands, right? And then as we move through that supply chain, again, even in the feedlot sector, I know there's a food versus feed debate, but a lot of the livestock feed is actually byproducts, right? And so energy development, ethanol production leads to distillers grains, which would be a waste product, which would just rot in the landfill. That goes into, again, food production. And then all the other byproducts that animals provide, right? Pharmaceuticals, leathers, all the different things that we as a species really benefit from. I think, again, we don't do a really good job of telling all of the different positive outcomes that this system has, as well as then, again, employment, right? So we have a lot of people that are employed in this sector and they have really valuable, meaningful work. I think we can always strive to do better in all of these things, right? Sustainability is one of those goals you never meet, right? There's no finish line. We can always continuously improve, but I think we got a really good story to tell. And again, we do a lot more than I think we give ourselves credit for at times.
I couldn't agree more. It's so much more nuanced than I ever even understood it was. I mean, and I'm fifth generation on my family's ranch, and I didn't quite realize how much went into not just our beef production chain, but all of the other industries that are incredibly interconnected with that. And I would say that that's sometimes what we lose sight of. So some of those kind of interconnectedness, we have a lot of conversations, particularly in the direct consumer space, around feeding your community and or feeding the world. And that seems to be very nuanced of there's some different perspectives of like, well, I'm gonna focus on feeding my community in this, more regenerative or whatever you want to term it, whatever buzz term, or continuing to feed the world. Could you talk about that a little bit? I think that there are some very different nuances depending on your mindset of who you're feeding per se.
Yeah, and I think it's both, right? Like I tend to be one that doesn't pick a side real easily, but I do think, right, there are benefits. And so even like feeding the world, right? So our beef production, a lot of our value comes from exporting, right, high quality beef, right? So we export steaks, we import hamburger, right? And that's a pretty good trade-off in terms of value. The poundage is pretty similar, but again, we export value because we're really good at marbling. We're really good, right? Our genetic base, our nutritionists, right, have done a really good job of determining how to efficiently produce nutrient dense and delicious beef, right? And so I think that's something that we're going to continue to do, specifically as the global population continues to increase, right? And the global middle class continues to increase. There's going to be continued demand, right? And so I think, as a global citizen, we have a kind of responsibility to do that, but also that's where a lot of the value for our industry as a whole comes from. But to bring it back local, right? Again, that feeding our community, it happens a couple of different ways. It's not, again, just food production, but again, ranches provide open space, right? And so we have the view sheds, right? That again may not be, a food or nutritious thing, but can be religious. It can be, right, all those cultural kind of values we get from open space, from providing habitat for animals, right? And so again, if ranches go out of business and we subdivide and put in condos, we no longer have wildlife corridors, right? We may no longer have elk, and so we don't have any of these game species as well as non-game species across the landscape as we want. We also just provide, again, support to our community. We do a lot of work on community security is the way that we frame it. And so again, providing value beyond just food production. It doesn't have to just be that I sell, meat and food to my neighbors. It's also I provide, right, because I'm here and I employ a certain number of people. Right now we have enough, again, people in our community to support a grocery store, so I don't have to drive an hour to go get groceries. Right, we have a bank, we have schools, and we can pay our teachers to actually educate our kids rather than having them spend 2 hours a day on a bus. And so there's a lot of ways that we feed our communities beyond simply food, right? And so we provide that support. And then, right, anytime there's sort of disasters going on, thinking about a lot of partners we have right now in Florida and North Carolina, right? And so we're there to help each other, pick each other up, right? And so again, that's not necessarily food production, but that's still a way of nurturing our communities. And I think we need to have a critical mass of people on the ground in order to ensure that those communities stay viable and that we're able to continue. Not just food production, right, but natural resource management and land stewardship over time.
For sure. It's it can become a very nuanced conversation around how maybe those things pull together where we live in kind of the middle of nowhere comparatively to a heavy population center. We think about all of these different pieces that actually are still kind of filtering into the same side. But we do get a lot of very specific conversations or questions from a consumer about exactly how it was raised, the environmental impact, all of the details. How would you help guide a consumer to think outside of just the label, I would say, or the buzzword of how could you kind of frame that for somebody to be like, hey, this is actually a little bigger conversation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Again, I can think we could get into the details and talk for days on this, but really, again, is critical thinking, right? And so, like, instead of this is the buzzword that I agree with, I'm gonna support this operation because they do whatever that is, really understand what that means and what the implications are, again, for your area as well as globally. And is this something that you want to promote everyone to do? Because again, if we start to restructure our entire food system, there's some pros and cons with any way we could go down that road. And really understanding, again, that nuance, as you say, I think is a good word, because a little tweak here or there on some operations can have a big difference, and on others it may not. And so are we worried about practices or outcomes? I think is one way to frame it too, specifically as we're getting into like public lands management now with outcomes-based grazing is, am I worried about people doing a certain thing, or am I worried about this outcome happening because of their actions, right? And so those are two different ways to, again, kind of vote with your dollar, is pay people to do things, but it may not have the outcome that we anticipate, either because, again, we're in a drought, we have a fire, or because some of the science just isn't as nuanced as the landscape is, right? So we have these kind of big theoretical models, and they work great in 80% of landscape, for example, but maybe not the other 20%. And so I think understanding that there's always a need for more knowledge and educating yourself, as well as supporting those people that are doing the fundamental research. So again, I mean, here at AgNext, we're actually doing a lot of this on the ground work just to verify what we think we know and find out what we don't know so we can do better, right? It's that continuous improvement. I also say don't get stuck in your ways because I've done this forever and this is the product I like, or this is whatever buzzword, fill in the blank that I support. Make sure that, again, the operations you're supporting are actually doing what you think they are, but then also make sure that those are the things that you still care about. Because again, as life changes and things happen, you may have a different set of values or beliefs that now drive your decisions, and you want to make sure that you align your purchasing with yourself, right, internally as well as those around you.
Yeah, that's great advice. So one specific question, particularly to beef cattle production, or maybe a different thought process, if you could shed light on this. And this is something that I want to say I took for granted in some ways, because it's as you just mentioned, it's like, well, we're doing the same things just because that's the way Grandpa did it. Then I stepped into this role and I was like, let's understand that. Let's make sure that that's the way that, we should be doing that for the sustainability, or, lack of a better term, for the future viability of our operation. When we think about any sort of food production, but particularly cattle production, we have an endpoint in mind for those animals, right? To be able to reach that endpoint to nourish our bodies. So there's a lot of nuances along the way of, particularly if we want to get into the specifics of grass-fed, grass-finished,
Mm-hmm.
or the grain-finished model. But understanding that we do have an endpoint with that, could you touch on some of the, I guess, the sustainability ramifications of that? If you have a grass-finished animal that may be 3 years old by the time they're harvested, and some of the inputs that went into that comparatively to the grain-finished model. Not to get in the weeds, but just as an overall thought of that animal, we domesticated those animals to be able to reach that endpoint of beef and
Mm-hmm.
nourish our bodies. So thinking about some of the impacts of the inputs that go into them as well.
Yeah, and that's a great kind of question debate, right? That I don't think is going to be put to bed anytime soon. But I will say that it takes a variety, and I think we want to have a variety of options and channels in even just beef production. To look at those two specifically, kind of the grain finished versus grass finished, right? They both have trade offs, right? And so, as you point out, the grass finished animals tend to be alive longer, right? They also tend to produce more methane every single day because the more forage in the diet, the more enteric methane that animal is going to produce. They're probably also going to have more of a water footprint, right? But then if we go to the feedlot side, right, we have all the feed production, right? And then again, whether that's inclusive to your operation or you're reliant on, transportation of food in, there's a greenhouse gas component to that as well as the feed production, right? And so is it a low carbon feed that you're buying? Is it, what sort of control do you have over that if you're a feedlot manager, right? And so I think again, this is one of those great debates that both sides are right and both sides are wrong, depending on what metric you want to use. And so, which one is it that you care about? How do you feel about, grass fed versus grain fed, and are there impacts to meat quality and quantity as well? And I think it's even beyond just grain versus grass, right? We have a lot of genetic potential out there as well that we're doing some work here at CSU looking at Brahman versus Angus and looking at, heat stress as well as input usage and looking at the greenhouse gas footprint of that, not just methane, but nitrous oxide as well, or ammonia. And then understanding the feed production to get, again, whether it's a certain endpoint or a certain age, right? We either have more inputs to those animals or they just have much smaller carcass sizes. So again, as it gets to hang on the rail, we can measure things like enteric methane in grams per head per day. We can look at grams per head per unit of dry matter intake, or grams per unit of beef, right? And so we do a lot of work here at AgNext looking specifically at methane because that's where kind of the industry's focused right now. But we can have 3 sets of cattle and there's a different set that wins in each of those metrics. So again, what you care about really, really drives what is the best or correct option for you. And so, again, it's a challenge because there's information overload right now. But again, I really encourage everyone to really sit down and think and do some research as to what does this mean, and what does this mean at scale? Is it something that I support because I support my local rancher and I want to get that steak that I know is going to be delicious, versus someone who's in New York City or LA that is arm's lengths removed from food production, and we want to make sure that we also have affordable, nutritious food for everyone that chooses it. Because again, sometimes as we get into these other kind of non-traditional, although they're actually more traditional, right? The conventional and non-conventional names always bother me because if you go far enough back, everything was conventional at one point in time. But if we go back to feedlot finished, which is a cheaper way to put feed or gain on animals versus some of these more expensive options, we've also increased the price of beef, right? And that's probably not fair to some of our more disadvantaged partners that can't afford food, right? I don't want to price beef out of everyone's diet because we enforce some sort of environmental or social outcome, right? And so I think we need to provide a variety for the marketplace, and then we need to provide information and let people make informed decisions and actually understand, again, what the entire system looks like, rather than what you read on the internet, right, or on X or whatever your social media preference may be.
That's a great point when we think about our systems as a whole, our food systems. And that was actually from Dr. Temple Grandin. Just like we realized, during COVID, how efficient our supply chains were, but we also, at the same time, realized how fragile they were.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really a thought process that most people within, most consumers in my generation had never really had to have. So I do believe that there has been a shift in the desire to want to understand those things a little bit more. But so, Dr. Ritten, as we close out, you've already given some great nuggets for consumers to consider. Do you have any final thoughts of, what somebody wants to make more informed decisions about where their food comes from, how it's produced, not just, buzzwords aside from sustainability, regenerative ag, etc. What advice would you give to a consumer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, right? So I live in academia, right? I've got stacks of journal articles all around me, right? So I'm neck deep in this, and I still get confused just about every single day. I think rely on some good independent, kind of third party partners, right? So local extension is great. Here in Colorado, we have a CSU extension is phenomenal. Just enterprise, reach out to people there. Land grant universities, it doesn't necessarily have to be specific to your state, right? So here in Colorado, right, I mean, you can look at Nebraska, Kansas, but again, Georgia has information, Wisconsin has information, California has information. Here at AgNext, we're a relatively new program at CSU, so we are a transdisciplinary research and engagement team. So we have and we're focused on animal ag, primarily beef right now, but dairy as well. We'll get into sheep as we build out the team. We're still pretty young. But again, what we really try to focus on is kind of distilling all of the information that not just we do as researchers, but really kind of consolidate information from relevant kind of geography and really make it digestible to anyone and everyone. So if you go to our website, we have blogs, we have 2-page fact sheets to talk about sustainability. And we really try to, be unbiased. Like, here's the pros and the cons, right? Here's some bad things that we need to work on, but here's things we're doing really well, right? And so it really is, our goal is to provide kind of, scalable, innovative solutions, right? And so we really need to test a lot of things. So we're oftentimes on the forefront and testing things that you're going to hear about in a couple of years. So we can tell you when it makes sense and when it doesn't, right? We're not afraid to say, no, don't do this, right? This is a bad idea for these reasons. But again, I just recommend to go out. Again, your land grant university systems are going to be key resources for unbiased information. We live in this space, and so we see stuff globally, right? And so we can try to translate that to your specific area. But again, just question everything, right? That's what I tell my students, what I tell my kids, right? Question everything, because everything that is true now was not true at some point in the past, right? And so we're continuing to evolve the science and our understanding of these systems. And so let's continue to do that and be ready to face the challenges of not just today, but tomorrow.
That's great advice. Coming from my background of being in production ag, also have been in academia, have been in industry, now in entrepreneurship. Having that, being curious, staying curious, and asking those questions, I think is a great thought process to have, no matter what it is. So I think that's something great to leave with our consumers. So as we wrap up today's episode, I'm going to leave you with some additional food for thought. In a world where every choice matters, let's approach consumption with mindful intention. Seek knowledge, engage in meaningful conversations, and shape your legacy with purpose. Remember, each moment is an opportunity for growth and impact. So stay inspired, stay empowered, and keep fueling your legacy. Thank you for tuning in to Steak Bites. Until next time.